Chapter 26 of The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit librivox.org. Recorded by Anka in Mannheim, Germany, August 2010. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 26 The Pont du Gard Inn. Such of my readers as have made a pedestrian excursion to the south of France may perchance have noticed, about midway between the town of Beaucaire and the village of Bellegarde, a little nearer to the former than to the latter, a small roadside inn, from the front of which hung, creaking and flapping in the wind, a sheet of tin covered with a grotesque representation of the Pont du Gard. This modern place of entertainment stood on the left-hand side of the post road and backed upon to the Rhône. It also boasted of what in Languedoc is styled a garden, consisting of a small plot of ground, on the side opposite to the main entrance reserved for the reception of guests. A few dingy olives and stunted fig trees struggled hard for existence, but their withered dusty foliage abundantly proved how unequal was the conflict. Between these sickly shrubs grew a scanty supply of garlic, tomatoes, and escalots, while, lone and solitary, like a forgotten sentinel, a tall pine raised its melancholy head in one of the corners of this unattractive spot, and displayed its flexible stem and fan-shaped summit dried and cracked by the fierce heat of the subtropical sun. In the surrounding plain, which more resembled a dusty lake than solid ground, were scattered a few miserable stalks of wheat, the effect, no doubt, of a curious desire on the part of the agriculturists of the country to see whether such a thing as the raising of grain in those parched regions was practicable. Each stalk served as a perch for a grasshopper, which regaled the passers-by through this Egyptian scene with its strident, monotonous tone. For about 7 or 8 years the little tavern had been kept by a man and his wife with 2 servants, a chambermaid named Trinette, and an ostler called Picot. This small staff was quite equal to all the requirements, for a canal between Beaucaire and Aigues-Mortes had revolutionized transportation by substituting boats for the cart and the stagecoach. And, as though to add to the daily misery which this prosperous canal inflicted on the unfortunate innkeeper, whose utter ruin it was fast accomplishing, it was situated between the Rhône, from which it had its source, and the post-road it had depleted, not 100 steps from the inn, of which we have given a brief but faithful description. The innkeeper himself was a man of from 40 to 50 years of age, tall, strong, and bony, a perfect specimen of the natives of those southern latitudes. He had dark, sparkling, and deep-set eyes, hooked nose, and teeth white as those of a carnivorous animal. His hair, like his beard, which he wore under his chin, was thick and curly, and in spite of his age but slightly interspersed with a few silvery threads. His naturally dark complexion had assumed a still further shade of brown, from the habit the unfortunate man had acquired of stationing himself from morning till eve at the threshold of his door, on the lookout for guests who seldom came. Yet there he stood, day after day, exposed to the meridional rays of a burning sun, with no other protection for his head than a red handkerchief twisted around it, after the manner of the Spanish muleteers. This man was our old acquaintance, Gaspard Caderousse. His wife, on the contrary, whose maiden name had been Madeleine Radel, was pale, meagre, and sickly-looking. Born in the neighbourhood of Arles, she had shared in the beauty of which its women are proverbial, but that beauty had gradually withered between the devastating influence of the slow fever so prevalent among dwellers by the ponds of Aigues-Mortes and the marshes of Camargue. She remained nearly always in her second-floor chamber, shivering in her chair or stretched languid and feeble on her bed, while her husband kept his daily watch at the door, a duty he performed with so much the greater willingness, as it saved him the necessity of listening to the endless plaints and murmurs of his helpmate, who never saw him without breaking into bitter invectives against fate, to all of which her husband would calmly return an unvarying reply in these philosophic words: "Hush, la Carconte! It is God's pleasure that things should be so." The sobriquet of La Carconte had been bestowed on Madeleine Radel from the fact that she had been born in a village so called, situated between Salon and Lambesc, and as a custom existed among the inhabitants of that part of France where Caderousse lived of styling every person by some particular and distinctive appellation. Her husband had bestowed on her the name of La Carconte in place of a sweet and euphonious name of Madeleine, which in all probability his rude guttural language would not have enabled him to pronounce. Still, let it not be supposed that amid this affected resignation of the will of Providence, the unfortunate innkeeper did not writhe under the double misery of seeing the hateful canal carry off his customers and his profits, and the daily infliction of his peevish partner's murmurs and lamentations. Like other dwellers in the south, he was a man of sober habits and moderate desires, but fond of external show, vain and addicted to display. During the days of his prosperity, not a festivity took place without himself and wife being among the spectators. He dressed in the picturesque costume worn upon grand occasions by the inhabitants of the south of France, bearing equal resemblance to the style adopted both by the Catalans and Andalusians, while La Carconte displayed the charming fashion prevalent among the women of Arles, a mode of attire borrowed equally from Greece and Arabia. But by degrees, watch chains, necklaces, parti-coloured scarfs, embroidered bodices, velvet vests, elegantly worked stockings, striped gaiters, and silver buckles for the shoes, all disappeared, and Gaspard Caderousse, unable to appear abroad in his pristine splendour, had given up any further participation in the pomps and vanities, both for himself and wife, although a bitter feeling of envious discontent filled his mind as the sound of mirth and merry music from the joyous revellers reached even the miserable hostelry to which he still clung, more for the shelter than the profit it afforded. Caderousse then was, as usual, at his place of observation before the door, his eyes glancing listlessly from a piece of closely shaven grass, on which some fowls were industriously, though fruitlessly, endeavouring to turn up some grain or insect suited to their palate, to the deserted road, which led away to the north and south, when he was aroused by the shrill voice of his wife, and grumbling to himself as he went, he mounted to her chamber, first taking care, however, to set the entrance door wide open, as an invitation to any chance traveller who might be passing. At the moment Caderousse quitted his sentry-like watch before the door, the road on which he so eagerly strained his sight was void and lonely as a desert at midday. There it lay, stretching out into one interminable line of dust and sand, with its side bordered by tall, meagre trees, altogether presenting so uninviting an appearance that no one in his senses could have imagined that any traveller, at liberty to regulate his hours for journeying, would choose to expose himself in such a formidable Sahara. Nevertheless, had Caderousse but retained his post a few minutes longer, he might have caught a dim outline of something approaching from the direction of Bellegarde. As the moving object drew nearer, he would easily have perceived that it consisted of a man and horse, between whom the kindest and most amiable understanding appeared to exist. The horse was of Hungarian breed, and ambled along at an easy pace. His rider was a priest, dressed in black and wearing a three-cornered hat, and, spite of the ardent rays of a noonday sun, the pair came on with a fair degree of rapidity. Having arrived before the Pont du Gard, the horse stopped, but whether for his own pleasure or that of his rider would have been difficult to say. However that might have been, the priest, dismounting, led his steed by the bridle in search of some place to which he could secure him. Availing himself of a handle that projected from a half-fallen door, he tied the animal safely, and having drawn a red cotton handkerchief from his pocket, wiped away the perspiration that streamed from his brow. Then, advancing to the door, struck thrice with the end of his iron-shod stick. At this unusual sound, a huge black dog came rushing to meet the daring assailant of his ordinarily tranquil abode, snarling, and displaying his sharp white teeth with a determined hostility that abundantly proved how little he was accustomed to society. At that moment a heavy footstep was heard descending the wooden staircase that led from the upper floor, and, with many bows and courteous smiles, mine host of the Pont du Gard besought his guest to enter. "You are welcome, sir, most welcome," repeated the astonished Caderousse. "Now then, Magotin," he cried, speaking to the dogs, "will you be quiet? Pray don't heed him, sir. He only barks, he never bites. I make no doubt a glass of good wine would be acceptable this dreadfully hot day." Then perceiving for the first time the garb of the traveller he had to entertain, Caderousse hastily exclaimed, "1,000 pardons! I really did not observe whom I had the honour to receive under my poor roof. What would the Abbé please to have? What refreshment can I offer? All I have is at his service." The priest gazed on the person addressing him with a long and searching gaze. There even seemed a disposition on his part to court a similar scrutiny on the part of the innkeeper. Then, observing in the countenance of the latter no other expression than extreme surprise as his own want of attention to an inquiry so courteously worded, he deemed it as well to terminate this dumb show, and therefore said, speaking with a strong Italian accent, "You are, I presume, Monsieur Caderousse?" "Yes, sir," answered the host, even more surprised at the question than he had been by the silence which had preceded it. "I am Gaspard Caderousse, at your service." "Gaspard Caderousse," rejoined the priest. "Yes, Christian and surname are the same. You formerly lived, I believe, in the Allée des Millions, on the 4th floor?" "I did." "And you followed the business of a tailor?" "True, I was a tailor, till the trade fell off. It is so hot at Marseille, that really I believe that the respectable inhabitants will in time go without any clothing whatever. But talking of heat, is there nothing I can offer you by way of refreshment?" "Yes, let me have a bottle of your best wine, and then, with your permission, I will resume our conversation from where we left off." "As you please, sir," said Caderousse, who, anxious not to lose the present opportunity of finding a customer for one of the few bottles of Cahors still remaining in his possession, hastily raised a trapdoor in the floor of the apartment they were in, which served both as a parlour and kitchen. Upon issuing forth from his subterranean retreat at the expiration of 5 minutes, he found the abbé seated upon a wooden stool, leaning his elbow on a table, while Margottin, whose animosity seemed appeased by the unusual command of the traveller for refreshments, had crept up to him and had established himself very comfortably between his knees, his long skinny neck resting on his lap, while his dim eye was fixed earnestly on the traveller's face. "Are you quite alone?" inquired the guest, as Caderousse placed before him the bottle of wine and a glass. Quite alone," replied the man, "or at least practically so, for my poor wife, who is the only person in the house beside myself, is laid up with illness, and unable to render me the least assistance, poor thing." "You are married, then?" said the priest, with a show of interest, glancing round, as he spoke, at the scanty furnishing of the apartment. "Ah, sir," said Caderousse with a sigh, "it is easy to perceive I am not a rich man, but in this world a man does not thrive the better for being honest." The abbé fixed on him a searching, penetrating glance. "Yes, honest, I can certainly say that much for myself," continued the innkeeper, fairly sustaining the scrutiny of the abbé's gaze. "I can boast with truth of being an honest man, and," continued he significantly, with a hand on his breast and shaking his head, "that is more than every one can say nowadays." "So much the better for you, if what you assert be true," said the abbé, "for I am firmly persuaded that, sooner or later, the good will be rewarded and the wicked punished." "Such words as those belong to your profession," answered Caderousse, "and you do well to repeat them. But," he added, with a bitter expression of countenance, "one is free to believe them or not, as one pleases." "You are wrong to speak thus," said the abbé, "and perhaps I may, in my own person, be able to prove to you how completely you are in error." "What mean you?" inquired Caderousse, with a look of surprise. "In the first place, I must be satisfied that you are the person I am in search of." "What proofs do you require?" "Did you, in the year 1814 or 1815, know anything of a young sailor named Dantès?" "Dantès? Did I know poor dear Edmond? Why, Edmond Dantès and myself were intimate friends," exclaimed Caderousse, whose countenance flushed darkly as he caught the penetrating gaze of the abbé fixed on him, while the clear, calm eye of the questioner seemed to dilate with feverish scrutiny. "You remind me," said the priest, "that the young man concerning whom I asked you was said to bear the name of Edmond." "Said to bear the name?" repeated Caderousse, becoming excited and eager. "Why, he was so called as truly as I myself bore the appellation of Gaspard Caderousse. But tell me, I pray, what has become of poor Edmond? Did you know him? Is he alive and at liberty? Is he prosperous and happy?" "He died a more wretched, hopeless, heart-broken prisoner than the felons who pay the penalty of their crimes at the galleys of Toulon." A deadly pallor followed the flush on the countenance of Caderousse, who turned away, and the priest saw him wiping the tears from his eyes with the corner of the red handkerchief twisted around his head. Poor fellow," murmured Caderousse. "Well, there, sir, is another proof that good people are never rewarded on this earth, and that none but the wicked prosper. Ah!" continued Caderousse, speaking in the highly coloured language of the South, "the world grows worse and worse. Why does not God, if he really hates the wicked, as he is said to do, send down brimstone and fire, and consume them altogether?" "You speak as though you had loved this young Dantès," observed the abbé, without taking any notice of his companion's vehemence. "And so I did," replied Caderousse, "though once, I confess, I envied him his good fortune. But I swear to you, sir, I swear to you, by everything a man holds dear, I have since then deeply and sincerely lamented his unhappy fate." There was a brief silence, during which the fixed, searching eye of the abbé was employed in scrutinizing the agitated features of the innkeeper. "You knew the poor lad, then?" continued Caderousse. "I was called to see him on his dying bed, that I might administer to him the consolations of religion." "And of what did he die?" asked Caderousse in a choking voice. "Of what, think you, do young and strong men die in prison, when they have scarcely numbered their 30th year, unless it be of imprisonment?" Caderousse wiped away the large beads of perspiration that gathered on his brow. "But the strangest part of the story is," resumed the abbé, "that Dantès, even in his dying moments, swore by his crucified Redeemer that he was utterly ignorant of the cause of his detention." "And so he was," murmured Caderousse. "How should he have been otherwise? Ah, sir, the poor fellow told you the truth." "And for that reason he besought me to try and clear up a mystery he had never been able to penetrate, and to clear his memory should any foul spot or stain have fallen on it." And here the look of the abbé, becoming more and more fixed, seemed to rest with ill-concealed satisfaction on the gloomy depression which was rapidly spreading over the countenance of Caderousse. "A rich Englishman," continued the abbé, "who had been his companion in misfortune, but had been released from prison during the Second Restoration, was possessed of a diamond of immense value. This jewel he bestowed on Dantès upon himself quitting the prison, as a mark of his gratitude for the kindness and brotherly care with which Dantès had nursed him in a severe illness he underwent during his confinement. Instead of employing this diamond in attempting to bribe his jailers, who might only have taken it and then betrayed him to the governor, Dantès carefully preserved it, that in the event of his getting out of prison he might have wherewithal to live, for the sale of such a diamond would have quite sufficed to make his fortune." "Then I suppose," asked Caderousse, with eager, glowing looks, "that it was a stone of immense value?" "Why, everything is relative," answered the abbé. "To one in Edmond's position, the diamond certainly was of great value. It was estimated at 50,000 francs. "Bless me!" exclaimed Caderousse. 50,000 francs! Surely the diamond was as large as a nut to be worth all that." "No," replied the abbé, "it was not of such a size as that, but you shall judge for yourself. I have it with me." The sharp gaze of Caderousse was instantly directed towards the priest's garments, as though hoping to discover the location of the treasure. Calmly drawing forth from his pocket a small box covered with black shagreen, the abbé opened it, and displayed to the dazzled eyes of Caderousse the sparkling jewel it contained, set in a ring of admirable workmanship. "And that diamond," cried Caderousse, almost breathless with eager admiration, "you say is worth 50,000 francs?" "It is without the setting, which is also valuable," replied the abbé, as he closed the box and returned it to his pocket, while its brilliant hues seemed still to dance before the eyes of the fascinated innkeeper. "But how comes the diamond in your possession, sir? Did Edmond make you his heir?" "No, merely his testamentary executor. I once possessed 4 dear and faithful friends, besides the maiden to whom I was betrothed," he said, "and I feel convinced they have all unfeignedly grieved over my loss. The name of one of the 4 friends is Caderousse." The innkeeper shivered. "Another of the number," continued the abbé, without seeming to notice the emotion of Caderousse, "is called Danglars. And the third, in spite of being my rival, entertained a very sincere affection for me." A fiendish smile played over the features of Caderousse, who was about to break in upon the abbé's speech, when the latter, waving his hand, said, "Allow me to finish first, and then if you have any observations to make, you can do so afterwards. The third of my friends, although my rival, was much attached to me. His name was Fanon. That of my betrothed was—" Stay, continued the abbé. "I have forgotten what he called her." "Mercédès," said Caderousse eagerly. "True," said the abbé, with a stifled sigh. "Mercédès it was." "Go on," urged Caderousse. "Bring me a carafe of water," said the abbé. Caderousse quickly performed the stranger's bidding, and after pouring some into a glass, and slowly swallowing its contents, the abbé, resuming his usual placidity of manner, said, as he placed his empty glass on the table, "Where did we leave off?" The name of Edmond's betrothed was Mercédès. "To be sure. You will go to Marseille," said Dantès, "for you understand, I repeat his words just as he uttered them. Do you understand?" "Perfectly." "You will sell this diamond. You will divide the money into 5 equal parts, and give an equal portion to these good friends, the only persons who have loved me upon earth." "But why into 5 parts?" asked Caderousse. "You only mentioned 4 persons." "Because the 5th is dead, as I hear. The 5th sharer in Edmond's bequest was his own father." "Too true, too true," ejaculated Caderousse, almost suffocated by the contending passions which assailed him. "The poor old man did die." "I learned so much at Marseille," replied the abbé, making a strong effort to appear indifferent. "But from the length of time that has elapsed since the death of the elder Dantès, I was unable to obtain any particulars of his end. Can you enlighten me on that point?" "I do not know who could if I could not," said Caderousse. "Why, I lived almost on the same floor with the poor old man." "Ah, yes, about a year after the disappearance of his son, the poor old man died." "Of what did he die?" "Why, the doctors called his complaint gastroenteritis, I believe. His acquaintances say he died of grief. But I, who saw him in his dying moments, I say he died of—" Caderousse paused. "Of what?" said the priest, anxiously and eagerly. "Why, of downright starvation." "Starvation!" exclaimed the abbé, springing from his seat. "Why, the vilest animals are not suffered to die by such a death as that. The very dogs that wander houseless and homeless in the streets find some pitying hand to cast them a mouthful of bread, and that a man, a Christian, should be allowed to perish of hunger in the midst of other men who call themselves Christians is too horrible for belief. Oh, it is impossible, utterly impossible." "What I have said, answered Caderousse. "And you are a fool for having said anything about it," said a voice from the top of the stairs. "Why should you meddle with what does not concern you?" The 2 men turned quickly, and saw the sickly countenance of La Carconte peering between the baluster rails. Attracted by the sound of voices, she had feebly dragged herself down the stairs, and seated on the lower step, head on knees, she had listened to the foregoing conversation. "Mind your own business, wife," replied Caderousse sharply. "This gentleman asks me for information, which common politeness will not permit me to refuse." "Politeness, you simpleton!" retorted La Carconte. "What have you to do with politeness, I should like to know? Better study a little common prudence. How do you know the motives that person may have for trying to extract all he can from you?" "I pledge you my word, madame," said the abbé, "that my intentions are good, and that your husband can incur no risk, provided he answers me candidly." "Ah, that's all very fine," retorted the woman. "Nothing is easier than to begin with fair promises and assurances of nothing to fear. But when poor silly folks, like my husband there, have been persuaded to tell all they know, the promises and assurances of safety are quickly forgotten, and at some moment when nobody is expecting it, behold trouble and misery, and all sorts of persecutions, are heaped on the unfortunate wretches who cannot even see whence all their afflictions come. Nay, nay, my good woman, make yourself perfectly easy, I beg of you. Whatever evils may befall you, they will not be occasioned by my instrumentality, that I solemnly promise you." La Carconte muttered a few inarticulate words, then let her head again drop upon her knees, and went to a fit of ague, leaving the 2 speakers to resume the conversation, but remaining so as to be able to hear every word they uttered. Again the abbé had been obliged to swallow a draught of water, to calm the emotions that threatened to overpower him. When he had sufficiently recovered himself, he said, "It appears, then, that the miserable old man you were telling me of was forsaken by every one. Surely, had not such been the case, he would not have perished by so dreadful a death." "Why, he was not altogether forsaken," continued Caderousse, "for Mercédès the Catalan and Monsieur Morel were very kind to him, but somehow the poor old man had contracted a profound hatred for Fernand, the very person," added Caderousse with a bitter smile, "that you named just now as being one of Dantès' faithful and attached friends." "And was he not so?" asked the abbé. "Gaspard, Gaspard," murmured the woman, from her seat on the stairs, "mind what you are saying." Caderousse made no reply to these words, though evidently irritated and annoyed by the interruption, but, addressing the abbé, said, "Can a man be faithful to another whose wife he covets and desires for himself? But Dantès was so honourable and true in his own nature that he believed everybody's professions of friendship. Poor Edmond, he was cruelly deceived, but it was fortunate that he never knew, or he might have found it more difficult, when on his deathbed, to pardon his enemies. "And whatever people may say," continued Caderousse, in his native language, which was not altogether devoid of rude poetry, "I cannot help being more frightened at the idea of the malediction of the dead than the hatred of the living." "Imbecile!" exclaimed La Carconte. "Do you, then, know in what manner Fernand injured Dantès?" inquired the Abbé of Caderousse. "Do I? No one better." "Speak out, then, say what it was." "Gaspard!" cried La Carconte. "Do as you will, you are master, but if you take my advice, you'll hold your tongue." "Well, wife," replied Caderousse, "I don't know but what you're right." "So you will say nothing?" asked the Abbé. "Why, what good would it do?" asked Caderousse. "If the poor lad were living and came to me and begged that I would candidly tell which were his true and which his false friends, why, perhaps I should not hesitate. But you tell me he is no more, and therefore can have nothing to do with hatred or revenge, so let all such feeling be buried with him." "You prefer, then," said the Abbé, "that I should bestow on men you say are false and treacherous the reward intended for faithful friendship?" "That is true enough," returned Caderousse. "You say truly, the gift of poor Edmond was not meant for such traitors as Fernand and Danglars. Besides, what would it be to them? No more than a drop of water in the ocean." "Remember," chimed in La Carconte, "those two could crush you at a single blow." "How so?" inquired the Abbé. "Are these persons, then, so rich and powerful?" "Do you not know their history?" "I do not. Pray relate it to me." Caderousse seemed to reflect for a few moments, then said, "No, truly, it would take up too much time." "Well, my good friend," returned the Abbé, in a tone that indicated utter indifference on his part, "you are at liberty either to speak or to be silent, just as you please. For my own part, I respect your scruples and admire your sentiments, so let the matter end. I shall do my duty as conscientiously as I can, and fulfil my promise to the dying man. My first business will be to dispose of this diamond." So saying, the Abbé again drew the small box from his pocket, opened it, and contrived to hold it in such a light that a bright flash of brilliant hues passed before the dazzled eyes of Caderousse. "Wife, wife!" cried he in a hoarse voice, "come here!" "Diamond!" exclaimed La Carconte, rising and descending to the chamber with a tolerably firm step. "What diamond are you talking about?" "Why, did you not hear all we said?" inquired Caderousse. "It is a beautiful diamond, left by poor Edmond Dantès, to be sold, and the money divided between his father, Mercédès, his betrothed bride, Fernand Danglars, and myself. The jewel is worth at least 50,000 francs." "Oh, what a magnificent jewel!" cried the astonished woman. "The fifth part of the profits from this stone belongs to us, then, does it not?" asked Caderousse. "It does," replied the Abbé, "with the addition of an equal division of that part intended for the elder Dantès, which I believe myself at liberty to divide equally with the 4 survivors." "And why among us 4?" inquired Caderousse. "As being the friends as more esteemed and most faithful and devoted to him." "I don't call those friends who betray and ruin you," murmured the wife in her turn, in a low, muttering voice. "Of course not," rejoined Caderousse quickly. "No more do I, and that was what I was observing to this gentleman just now. I said I looked upon it as a sacrilegious profanation to reward treachery, perhaps crime." "Remember," answered the Abbé calmly, as he replaced the jewel and its case in the pocket of his cassock, "it is your fault, not mine, that I do so. You will have the goodness to furnish me with the address of both Fernand and Danglars, in order that I may execute Edmond's last wishes." The agitation of Caderousse became extreme, and large drops of perspiration rolled from his heated brow. He saw the Abbé rise from his seat and go towards the door, as though to ascertain if his horse was sufficiently refreshed to continue his journey. Caderousse and his wife exchanged looks of deep meaning. "There you see, wife," said the former, "this splendid diamond might all be ours, if we chose." "Do you believe it?" "Why, surely, a man of his holy profession would not deceive us." "Well," replied La Carconte, "do as you like. For my part, I wash my hands of the affair." So saying, she once more climbed the staircase leading to her chamber, her body convulsed with chills, and her teeth rattling in her head, in spite of the intense heat of the weather. Arrived at the top stair, she turned around, and called out in a warning tone to her husband, "Gaspard, consider well what you are about to do." "I have both reflected and decided," answered he. La Carconte then entered her chamber, the flooring of which creaked beneath her heavy, uncertain tread, as she proceeded towards her armchair, into which she fell as though exhausted. "Well," asked the Abbé, as he returned to the apartment below, "what have you made up your mind to do?" "To tell you all I know," was the reply. "I certainly think you act wisely in so doing," said the priest. "Not because I have the least desire to learn anything you may please to conceal from me, but simply that if, through your assistance, I could distribute the legacy according to the wishes of the testator, why so much the better, that is all." "I hope it may be so," replied Caderousse, his face flushed with cupidity. "I am all attention," said the Abbé. "Stop a minute," answered Caderousse. "We might be interrupted in the most interesting part of my story, which would be a pity, and it is as well that your visit hither should be made known only to ourselves." With these words he went stealthily to the door, which he closed, and, by way of still greater precaution, bolted and barred it, as he was accustomed to do at night. During this time the Abbé had chosen his place for listening at his ease. He removed his seat into a corner of the room, where he himself would be in deep shadow, while the light would be fully thrown on the narrator. Then, with head bent down and hands clasped, or rather clinched together, he repaired to give his whole attention to Caderousse, who seated himself on the little stool exactly opposite to him. "Remember, this is no affair of mine," said the trembling voice of La Carconte, as though through the flooring of her chamber she viewed the scene that was enacting below. "Enough, enough," replied Caderousse. "Say no more about it. I will take all the consequences upon myself." And he began his story. End of chapter 26.
This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Recording by Kelly Boucher of Mattapoisett, Massachusetts. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 27. The Story. "First, sir," said Caderousse, "you must make me a promise." "What is that?" inquired the abbé. "Why, if you ever make use of the details I am about to give you, that you will never let anyone know that it was I who supplied them, for the persons of whom I am about to talk are rich and powerful, and if they only laid the tips of their fingers on me, I should break to pieces like glass." "Make yourself easy, my friend," replied the abbé. "I am a priest, and confessions die in my breast. Recollect, our only desire is to carry out, in a fitting manner, the last wishes of our friend. Speak, then, without reserve, as without hatred. Tell the truth, the whole truth. I do not know, never may know, the persons of whom you are about to speak. Besides, I am an Italian and not a Frenchman, and belong to God and not to men, and I shall shortly retire to my convent, which I have only quitted to fulfill the last wishes of a dying man." This positive assurance seemed to give Caderousse a little courage. "Well, then, under these circumstances," said Caderousse, "I even believe I ought, to undeceive you as to the friendship which poor Edmund thought so sincere and unquestionable." "Begin with his father, if you please," said the abbé. "Edmund talked to me a great deal about the old man for whom he had the deepest love." "The history is a sad one," said Caderousse, shaking his head. "Perhaps you know all the earlier parts of it?" "Yes," answered the abbé. "Edmund related to me everything until the moment when he was arrested in a small cabaret close to Marseilles." "At La Réserve? Oh, yes, I can see it all before me this moment. Was it not his betrothal feast?" "It was, and the feast that began so gaily had a very sorrowful ending. A police commissary, followed by 4 soldiers, entered, and Dantès was arrested." "Yes, and up to this point I know all," said the priest. "Dantès himself only knew that which personally concerned him, for he never beheld again the 5 persons I have named to you, or heard mention of any of them. Well, when Dantès was arrested, Monsieur Morel hastened to obtain the particulars, and they were very sad. The old man returned alone to his home, folded up his wedding suit, with tears in his eyes, and paced up and down his chamber the whole day, and would not go to bed at all, for I was underneath him and heard him walking the whole night. And for myself, I assure you I could not sleep either, for the grief of the poor father gave me uneasiness, and every step he took went to my heart as really as if his foot had pressed against my breast. The next day Mercedes came to implore the protection of Monsieur de Villefort. She did not obtain it, however, and went to visit the old man. When she saw him so miserable and heartbroken, having passed a sleepless night and not touched food since the previous day, she wished him to go with her that she might take care of him. But the old man would not consent. "No," was the old man's reply, "I will not leave this house, for my poor dear boy loves me better than anything in the world, and if he gets out of prison he will come and see me the first thing. And what would he think if I did not wait here for him?" I heard all this from the window, for I was anxious that Mercedes should persuade the old man to accompany her, for his footsteps over my head all night and day did not leave me a moment's repose. "But did you not go upstairs and try to console the poor old man?" asked the abbé. "Ah, sir," replied Caderousse, "we cannot console those who will not be consoled, and he was one of these. Besides, I know not why, but he seemed to dislike seeing me. One night, however, I heard his sobs, and I could not resist my desire to go up to him. But when I reached his door, he was no longer weeping, but praying. I cannot now repeat to you, sir, all the eloquent words and imploring language he made use of. It was more than piety, it was more than grief, and I, who am no cantor, and hate the Jesuits, said then to myself, 'It is really well, and I am very glad that I have not any children, for if I were a father and felt such excessive grief as the old man does, and did not find in my memory or heart all that he is now saying, I should throw myself into the sea at once, for I could not bear it.'" "Poor father," murmured the priest. From day to day he lived on alone, and more solitary. Monsieur Morel and Mercedes came to see him, but his door was closed, and although I was certain he was at home, he would not make any answer. One day, when, contrary to his custom, he had admitted Mercedes, and the poor girl, in spite of her own grief and despair, endeavoured to console him, he said to her, "Be assured, my dear daughter, he is dead, and instead of expecting him, it is he who is awaiting us. I am quite happy, for I am the oldest, and of course shall see him first. However well-disposed a person may be, you will see why we leave off after a time seeing persons who are in sorrow. They make one melancholy, and so at last old Dantes was left all to himself, and I only saw from time to time strangers go up to him and come down again with some bundle they tried to hide. But I guessed what these bundles were, and that he sold by degrees what he had to pay for his sustenance. At length the poor old fellow reached the end of all he had. He owed 3/4 rent, and they threatened to turn him out. He begged for another week, which was granted to him. I know this because the landlord came into my apartment when he left his. For the first 3 days I heard him walking about as usual, but on the fourth I heard nothing. I then resolved to go up to him at all risks. The door was closed, but I looked through the keyhole and saw him so pale and haggard that, believing him very ill, I went and told Monsieur Morel, and then ran on to Mercedes. They both came immediately, Monsieur Morel bringing a doctor, and the doctor said it was inflammation of the bowels, and ordered him a limited diet. I was there too, and I shall never forget the old man's smile at this prescription. From that time he received all who came. He had an excuse for not eating any more. A doctor had put him on a diet. The abbé uttered a kind of groan. "The story interests you, does it not, sir?" inquired Caderousse. "Yes," replied the abbé, "it is very affecting." Mercedes came again, and she found him so altered that she was even more anxious than before to have him taken to her own home. This was Monsieur Morel's wish also, who would fain have conveyed the old man against his consent, but the old man resisted and cried so that they were actually frightened. Mercedes remained, therefore, by his bedside, and Monsieur Morel went away, making a sign to the Catalan that he had left his purse on the chimney-piece. But availing himself of the doctor's order, the old man would not take any sustenance. At length, after 9 days of despair and fasting, the old man died, cursing those who had caused his misery, and saying to Mercedes, "If you ever see my Edmund again, tell him I died blessing him." The abbé rose from his chair, made 2 turns round the chamber, and pressed his trembling hand against his parched throat. "And you believe he died—" "Of hunger, sir, of hunger," said Caderousse. "I am as certain of it as that we two are Christians." The abbé, with a shaking hand, seized the glass of water that was standing by him half full, swallowed it at one gulp, and then resumed his seat, with red eyes and pale cheeks. "This was indeed a horrid event," said he in a hoarse voice. "The more so, sir, as it was men's and not God's doing." "Tell me of those men," said the abbé, "and remember, too," he added in an almost menacing tone, You have promised to tell me everything. Tell me, therefore, who are these men who killed the son with despair and the father with famine?" "Two men jealous of him, sir, one from love and the other from ambition, Fernand and Danglars." "How is this jealousy manifested? Speak on." "They denounced Edmund as a Bonapartist agent." "Which of the two denounced him? Which was the real delinquent?" "Both, sir. One with a letter, and the other put it in the post." "And where was this letter written?" "At La Réserve, the day before the betrothal feast." "'Twas so then," murmured the abbé. "Oh, Faria, Faria, how well did you judge men and things!" "What did you please to say, sir?" Nothing," replied the priest. "Go on." "It was Danglars who wrote the denunciation with his left hand, that his writing might not be recognized, and Fernand who put it in the post." "But," exclaimed the abbé suddenly, "you were there yourself." "I!" said Caderousse, astonished. "Who told you I was there?" The abbé saw he had overshot the mark, and he added quickly, "No one, but in order to have known everything so well, you must have been an eyewitness." True, said Caderousse in a choking voice. "I was there." "And did you not remonstrate against such infamy?" asked the abbé. "If not, you were an accomplice." "Sir," replied Caderousse, "they had made me drink to such an excess that I nearly lost all perception. I had only an indistinct understanding of what was passing around me. I said all that a man in such a state could say, but they both assured me that it was a jest they were carrying on, and perfectly harmless." Next day, sir, you must have seen plain enough what they had been doing, yet you said nothing, though you were present when Dantès was arrested." "Yes, sir, I was there, and very anxious to speak, but Danglars restrained me." "If he should really be guilty," said he, "and did really put into the island of Elba, if he is really charged with a letter for the Bonapartist committee at Paris, and if they find this letter upon him, those who have supported him will pass for his accomplices. I confess I had my fears in the state in which politics then were, and I held my tongue. It was cowardly, I confess, but it was not criminal." "I understand. You allowed matters to take their course, that was all." "Yes, sir," answered Caderousse, "and remorse preys on me night and day. I often ask pardon of God, I swear to you, because this action, the only one with which I have seriously to reproach myself in all my life, is no doubt the cause of my abject condition. I am expiating a moment of selfishness, and so I always say to La Carconte, when she complains, 'Hold your tongue, woman, it is the will of God.'" And Caderousse bowed his head with every sign of real repentance. "Well, sir," said the abbé, "you have spoken unreservedly, and thus to accuse yourself is to deserve pardon. Unfortunately, Edmund is dead, and has not pardoned me." "He did not know," said the abbé. "But he knows it all now," interrupted Caderousse. "They say the dead know everything." There was a brief silence. The abbé rose and paced up and down pensively, and then resumed his seat. "You have 2 or 3 times mentioned Monsieur Morel," he said. "Who is he?" "The owner of the Pharaon and patron of Dantès." "And what part did he play in this sad drama?" inquired the abbé. "The part of an honest man, full of courage and real regard. 20 times he interceded for Edmund. When the emperor returned he wrote, implored, threatened, and so energetically that on the second restoration he was persecuted as a Bonapartist. 10 times, as I told you, he came to see Dantès' father, and offered to receive him in his own house, and the night or 2 before his death, as I have already said, he left his purse on the mantelpiece, with which they paid the old man's debts, and buried him decently. And so Edmund's father died as he had lived, without doing harm to anyone. I have the purse still by me, a large one, made of red silk." "And," asked the abbé, "is Monsieur Morel still alive?" "Yes," replied Caderousse. "In that case," replied the abbé, "he should be rich and happy." Caderousse smiled bitterly. "Yes, happy as myself," said he. "What! Monsieur Morel unhappy?" exclaimed the abbé. "He is reduced almost to the last extremity, nay, he is almost at the point of dishonour." "How?" "Yes," continued Caderousse, "so it is. After 25 years of labour, after having acquired a most honourable name in the trade of Marseille, Monsieur Morel is utterly ruined. He has lost 5 ships in 2 years, has suffered by the bankruptcy of 3 large houses, and his only hope now is in that very Pharaon which poor Dantès commanded, and which is expected from the Indies with a cargo of cochineal and indigo. If this ship founders like the others, he is a ruined man." "And has the unfortunate man wife or children?" inquired the abbé. "Yes, he has a wife, who through everything has behaved like an angel. He has a daughter, who is about to marry the man she loved, but whose family now will not allow him to wed the daughter of a ruined man. And he has besides a son, a lieutenant in the army, and as you may suppose, all this, instead of lessening, only augments his sorrows. If he were alone in the world, he would blow out his brains, and there would be an end." "Horrible!" ejaculated the priest. "And it is thus heaven recompenses virtue, sir," added Caderousse. "You see, I, who never did a bad action but that I have told you of, am in destitution with my poor wife dying of fever before my very eyes, and I unable to do anything in the world for her. I shall die of hunger, as old Dantes did, while Fernand and Danglars are rolling in wealth. How is that? Because their deeds have brought them good fortune, while honest men have been reduced to misery. What has become of Danglars, the instigator, and therefore the most guilty? What has become of him? Why, he left Marseilles and was taken, on the recommendation of Monsieur Morel, who did not know his crime, as cashier into a Spanish bank. During the war with Spain he was employed in the commissariat of the French army, and made a fortune. Then with that money he speculated in the funds, and trebled or quadrupled his capital, and having first married his banker's daughter, who left him a widower, he has married a second time, a widow, a Madame de Nargonne, daughter of Monsieur de Servieux, the king's chamberlain, who is in high favour at court. He is now a millionaire, and they have made him a baron. And now he is the Baron Danglars, with a fine residence in the Rue du Mont Blanc, with 10 horses in his stables, 6 footmen in his antechamber, and I know not how many millions in his strong-box." "Ah," said the abbé in a peculiar tone, "he is happy." "Happy? Who can answer for that? Happiness or unhappiness is the secret known but to oneself and the walls. Walls have ears but no tongues. But if a large fortune produces happiness, Danglars is happy. And Fernand? Fernand? Why, much the same story. But how could a poor Catalan fisher boy, without education or resources, make a fortune? I confess this staggers me. And it has staggered everyone. There must have been in his life some strange secret that no one knows. But then, by what visible steps has he attained this high fortune, or high position?" "Both, sir. He has both fortune and position. Both." "This must be impossible." "It would seem so. But listen, and you will understand. Some days before the return of the Emperor, Fernand was drafted. The Bourbons left him quietly enough at the Catalans, but when Napoleon returned a special levy was made, and Fernand was compelled to join. I went too, but as I was older than Fernand and had just married my poor wife, I was only sent to the coast. Fernand was enrolled in the active troop, went to the frontier with his regiment, and was at the Battle of Ligny. A night after the battle he was sentry at the door of a general who carried on a secret correspondence with the enemy. That same night the general was to go over to the English. He proposed to Fernand to accompany him. Fernand agreed to do so, deserted his post, and followed the general. Fernand would have been court-martialed if Napoleon had remained on the throne, but his action was rewarded by the Bourbons. He returned to France with the epaulet of sub-lieutenant, and as the protection of the general, who was in the highest favour, was accorded to him, he was a captain in 1823, during the Spanish War, that is to say, at the time when Danglars made his early speculations. Fernand was a Spaniard, and being sent to Spain to ascertain the feeling of his fellow countrymen, found Danglars there, got on very intimate terms with him, won over the support of the royalists of the capital and in the provinces, received promises and made pledges on his own part, guided his regiment by paths known to himself alone through the mountain gorges which were held by the royalists, and, in fact, rendered such services in this brief campaign that after the taking of Trocadero he was made colonel, and received the title of count and the cross of an officer of the Legion of Honour. "Destiny, destiny," murmured the abbé. "Yes, but listen, this was not all. The war with Spain being ended, Fernand's career was checked by the long peace which seemed likely to endure throughout Europe. Greece only had risen against Turkey and had begun her war of independence. All eyes were turned towards Athens. It was the fashion to pity and support the Greeks. The French government, without protecting them openly, as you know, gave countenance to volunteer assistance. Fernand sought and obtained leave to go and serve in Greece, still having his name kept on the army roll. Some time after, it was stated that the Comte de Morcerf, this was the name he bore, had entered the service of Ali Pasha with the rank of Instructor General. Ali Pasha was killed, as you know, but before he died he recompensed the services of Fernand by leaving him a considerable sum, with which he returned to France, when he was gazetted Lieutenant General. "So that now," inquired the abbé, "so that now," continued Caderousse, "he owns a magnificent house, Nombre 27, Rue de Elde, Paris." The abbé opened his mouth, hesitated for a moment, then making an effort at self-control, he said, "And Mercedes, they tell me that she has disappeared." "Disappeared?" said Caderousse. "Yes, as the sun disappears, to rise the next day with still more splendor." "Has she made a fortune also?" inquired the abbé with an ironical smile. "Mercedes is at this moment one of the greatest ladies in Paris," replied Caderousse. "Go on," said the abbé. "It seems as if I were listening to the story of a dream, but I have seen things so extraordinary that what you tell me seems less astonishing than it otherwise might. Mercedes was at first in the deepest despair at the blow which deprived her of Edmond. I have told you of her attempts to propitiate Monsieur de Villefort, her devotion to the elder Dantes. In the midst of her despair, a new affliction overtook her. This was the departure of Fernand whose crime she did not know, and whom she regarded as her brother. Fernand went, and Mercedes remained alone. 3 months passed, and still she wept. No news of Edmond, no news of Fernand, no companionship save that of an old man who was dying with despair. One evening, after a day of accustomed vigil at the angle of 2 roads leading to Marseilles from the Catalans, she returned to her home, more depressed than ever. Suddenly she heard a step she knew, turned anxiously around. The door opened, and Fernand, dressed in the uniform of a sub-lieutenant, stood before her. It was not the one she wished for most, but it seemed as if a part of her past life had returned to her. Mercedes seized Fernand's hands with a transport which he took for love, but which was only joy at being no longer alone in the world, and seeing at last a friend, after long hours of solitary sorrow. And then, it must be confessed, Fernand had never been hated. He was only not precisely loved. Another possessed all Mercedes' heart. That other was absent, had disappeared, perhaps was dead. At this last thought, Mercedes burst into a flood of tears and wrung her hands in agony, but the thought, which she had always repelled before when it was suggested to her by another, came now in full force upon her mind. And then, too, old Dantes incessantly said to her, "Our Edmond is dead. If he were not, he would return to us." The old man died, as I have told you. Had he lived, Mercedes, perchance, had not become the wife of another, for he would have been there to reproach her infidelity. Fernand saw this, and when he learned of the old man's death, he returned. He was now lieutenant. At his first coming he had not said a word of love to Mercedes. At the second he reminded her that he loved her. Mercedes begged for 6 months more in which to await and mourn for Edmond. "So that," said the abbé with a bitter smile, "that makes 18 months in all. What more could the most devoted lover desire?" Then he murmured the words of the English poet, "Frailty, thy name is woman." 6 months afterward, continued Caderousse, the marriage took place in the church of Accusation. "The very church in which she was to have married Edmond," murmured the priest. "There was only a change of bridegrooms." "Well, Mercedes was married," proceeded Caderousse, "but although in the eyes of the world she appeared calm, she nearly fainted as she passed La Reserve, where 18 months before the betrothal had been celebrated with him whom she might have known she still loved had she looked to the bottom of her heart. Fernand more happy, but not more at his ease, for I saw it, at this time he was in constant dread of Edmond's return. Fernand was very anxious to get his wife away and to depart himself. There were too many unpleasant possibilities associated with the Catalans, and 8 days after the wedding they left Marseilles." "Did you ever see Mercedes again?" inquired the priest. "Yes, during the Spanish War at Perpignan, where Fernand had left her. She was attending to the education of her son." The abbé started. "Her son?" said he. "Yes," replied Caderousse, "little Albert." "But, then, to be able to instruct her child," continued the abbé, "she must have received an education herself. I understood from Edmond that she was the daughter of a simple fisherman, beautiful but uneducated." "Oh," replied Caderousse, "did he know so little of his lovely betrothed? Mercédès might have been a queen, sir, if the crown were to be placed on the heads of the loveliest and most intelligent. Fernand's fortune was already waxing great, and she developed with his growing fortune. She learned drawing, music, everything. Besides, I believe, between ourselves, she did this in order to distract her mind, that she might forget, and she only filled her head in order to alleviate the weight on her heart. But now her position in life is assured," continued Caderousse. "No doubt fortune and honours have comforted her. She is rich, a countess, and yet—" Caderousse paused. "And yet what?" asked the abbé. "Yet I'm sure she is not happy," said Caderousse. "What makes you believe this?" "Why, when I found myself utterly destitute, I thought my old friends would perhaps assist me. So I went to Danglars, who would not even receive me. I called on Fernand, who sent me 100 francs by his valet de chambre." "Then you did not see either of them?" "No, but Madame de Morcerf saw me." "How was that?" "As I went away, a purse fell at my feet. It contained 25 louis. I raised my head quickly and saw Mercédès, who at once shut the blind." "And Monsieur de Villefort?" asked the abbé. "Oh, he never was a friend of mine. I did not know him, and I had nothing to ask of him." "Do you not know what became of him and the share he had in Edmond's misfortunes?" "No, I only know that some time after Edmond's arrest he married Mademoiselle de Saint-Méran, and soon after left Marseilles. No doubt he has been as lucky as the rest. No doubt he is as rich as Danglars, as high in station as Fernand. I only, as you see, have remained poor, wretched, and forgotten." "You are mistaken, my friend," replied the abbé. "God may seem sometimes to forget for a time, while his justice reposes, but there always comes a moment when he remembers, and behold, a proof." As he spoke, the abbé took the diamond from his pocket, and giving it to Caderousse, said, "Here, my friend, take this diamond, it is yours." "What, for me only?" cried Caderousse. "Ah, sir, do not jest with me." This diamond was to have been shared among his friends. Edmond had one friend only, and thus it cannot be divided. Take the diamond, then, and sell it. It is worth 50,000 francs, and I repeat my wish that this sum may suffice to release you from your wretchedness." "Oh, sir," said Caderousse, putting out one hand timidly, and with the other wiping away the perspiration which bedewed his brow. "Oh, sir, do not make jests of the happiness or despair of a man." "I know what happiness and what despair are, and I never make a jest of such feelings. Take it, then, but in exchange—" Caderousse, who touched the diamond, withdrew his hand. The abbé smiled. "In exchange," he continued, "give me the red silk purse that Monsieur Morel left on old Dante's chimney-piece, and which you tell me is still in your hands." Caderousse, more and more astonished, went toward a large oaken cupboard, opened it, and gave the abbé a long purse of faded red silk, round which were 2 copper runners that had once been gilt. The abbé took it, and in return gave Caderousse the diamond. "Oh, you are a man of God, sir," cried Caderousse, "for no one knew that Edmond had given you this diamond, and you might have kept it." "Which," said the abbé to himself, "you would have done." The abbé rose, took his hat and gloves. "Well," he said, "all you have told me is perfectly true, then, and I may believe it in every particular?" "See, sir," replied Caderousse, "in this corner is a crucifix in holy wood. Here on this shelf is my wife's testament. Open this book, and I will swear upon it with my hand on the crucifix. I will swear to you by my soul's salvation, my faith as a Christian. I have told everything to you as it occurred, and as the recording angel will tell it to the ear of God at the day of the last judgment." "'Tis well," said the abbé, convinced by his manner and tone that Caderousse spoke the truth. "'Tis well, and may this money profit you. Adieu. I go far from men who thus so bitterly injure each other." The abbé with difficulty got away from the enthusiastic thanks of Caderousse, opened the door himself, got out, and mounted his horse, once more saluted the innkeeper, who kept uttering his loud farewells, and then returned by the road he had travelled in coming. When Caderousse turned around, he saw behind him La Carconte, paler and trembling more than ever. "Is, then, all that I have heard really true?" she inquired. "What, that he has given the diamond to us only?" inquired Caderousse, half bewildered with joy. "Yes, nothing more true. See, here it is." The woman gazed at it a moment, and then said, in a gloomy voice, "Suppose it's false?" Caderousse started and turned pale. "False?" he muttered. "False? Why should that man give me a false diamond?" "To get your secret without paying for it, you blockhead." Caderousse remained for a moment aghast under the weight of such an idea. "Oh," he said, taking up his hat, which he placed on the red handkerchief tied round his head, "we will soon find out." "In what way?" "Why, the fair is on at Beaucaire. There are always jewellers from Paris there, and I will show it to them. Look after the house, wife, and I shall be back in 2 hours." And Caderousse left the house in haste, and ran rapidly in the direction opposite to that which the priest had taken. 50,000 francs, muttered La Carconte, when left alone. "It is a large sum of money, but it is not a fortune." End of chapter 27.
This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Recorded by Chip in Tampa, Florida, on March 16th, 2006. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 28. The Prison Register. The day after that in which the scene we have just described had taken place on the road between Bellegarde and Beaucaire, a man of about 30, or 32, dressed in a bright blue frock coat, nankeen trousers, and a white waistcoat, having the appearance and accent of an Englishman, presented himself before the mayor of Marseille. "Sir," said he, "I am chief clerk of the house of Thomson and French of Rome. We are, and have been these 10 years, connected with the house of Morel and Son of Marseille. We have 100,000 francs or thereabouts loaned on their securities, and we are a little uneasy at the reports which have reached us that the firm is on the brink of ruin. I have come, therefore, express from Rome, to ask you for information." "Sir," replied the mayor, "I know very well that during the last 4 or 5 years misfortune has seemed to pursue Monsieur Morel. He has lost 4 or 5 vessels, and has suffered by 3 or 4 bankruptcies, but it is not for me, although I am a creditor myself to the amount of 10,000 francs, to give any information as to the state of his finances. Ask me, as mayor, what is my opinion of Monsieur Morel, and I shall say that he is a man honourable to the last degree, and who has, up to this time, fulfilled every engagement with scrupulous punctuality. That is all I can say, sir. If you wish to know more, address yourself to Monsieur de Beauvais, the inspector of prisons, number 15, Rue de Nouailles. He has, I believe, 200,000 francs in Morel's hands, and if there be any grounds for apprehension, as this is a greater amount than mine, you will most probably find him better informed than myself." The Englishman seemed to appreciate this extreme delicacy, made his bow, and went away, proceeding with the characteristic British stride toward the street mentioned. Monsieur de Beauvais was in his private room, and the Englishman, on perceiving him, made a gesture of surprise, which seemed to indicate that it was not the first time he had been in his presence. As to Monsieur de Beauvais, he was in such a state of despair that it was evident that all the faculties of his mind, absorbed in the thought which occupied them at the moment, did not allow either his memory or his imagination to stray into the past. The Englishman, with the coolness of his nation, addressed him in terms nearly similar to those with which he had accosted the mayor of Marseille. "Oh, sir," exclaimed Monsieur de Beauvais, "your fears are unfortunately but too well founded. And you see before you a man in despair. I had 200,000 francs placed in the hands of Morel and Son. These 200,000 francs were the dowry of my daughter, who was to be married in a fortnight, and these 200,000 francs were payable half on the 15th of this month, the other half on the 15th of next month. I had informed Monsieur Morel of my desire to have these payments punctually, and he has been here within the last half hour to tell me that if his ship, the Pharaon, does not come into port on the 15th, he will be wholly unable to make this payment." "But," said the Englishman, "this looks very much like a suspension of payment." "It looks more like bankruptcy," exclaimed Monsieur de Beauvais despairingly. The Englishman appeared to reflect a moment, and said, "From which it would appear, sir, that this credit inspires you with considerable apprehension." "To tell the truth, I consider it lost." "Well, then, I will buy it of you." "You?" "Yes, I. But at a tremendous discount, of course. No, for 200,000 francs. Our house," added the Englishman with a laugh, "does not do things that way." "And you will pay?" "Ready money." And the Englishman withdrew from his pocket a bundle of banknotes, which might have been twice the sum Monsieur de Beauville feared to lose. A ray of joy passed across Monsieur de Beauville's countenance, yet he made an effort at self-control, and said, "Sir, I ought to tell you that in all probability you will not realize 6% of this sum." "That's no affair of mine," replied the Englishman. "That is the affair of the houses of Thomson and French, in whose name I act. They have, perhaps, some motive to serve in hastening the ruin of a rival firm, but all I know, sir, is that I am ready to hand you over this sum in exchange for your assignment of the debt. I only ask a brokerage." "Well, of course, that is perfectly just," cried Monsieur de Beauville. "The commission is usually 1.5. Will you have 2, 3, 5%, even more, whatever you say?" "Sir," replied the Englishman, laughing, "I am like my house. I do not do such things. No, the commission that I ask is quite different." "Name it, sir, I beg." "You are the inspector of prisons?" "I have been so these 14 years." "You keep the registers of entries and departures?" "I do." "To these registers there are added notes relative to the prisoners?" "There are special reports on every prisoner." "Well, sir, I was educated at home by a poor devil of an abbé who disappeared suddenly. I have since learned that he was confined in the Château d'If, and I should like to learn some particulars of his death." "What was his name?" "The Abbé Faria." "Oh, I recall him perfectly," cried Monsieur de Beauville. "He was crazy." "So they said." "Oh, he was, decidedly." "Very possibly. What sort of madness was it?" "He pretended to know of an immense treasure, and offered vast sums to the government if they would liberate him." "Poor devil! And he is dead?" "Yes, sir, 5 or 6 months ago, last February." "You have a good memory, sir, to recall dates so well." "I recall this because the poor devil's death was accompanied by a singular incident." "May I ask what that was?" said the Englishman with an expression of curiosity, which a close observer would have been astonished at discovering in his phlegmatic countenance. "Oh dear, yes, sir. The abbé's dungeon was 40 or 50 feet distant from that which one of Bonaparte's emissaries, one of those who had contributed the most to the return of the usurper in 1815, a very resolute and very dangerous man." "Indeed," said the Englishman. "Yes," replied Monsieur de Beauville. "I myself had occasion to see this man in 1816 or 1817, and we could only go into his dungeon with a file of soldiers. That man made a deep impression on me. I shall never forget his countenance." The Englishman smiled imperceptibly. "As you say, sir," he interposed, "that the 2 dungeons were separated by a distance of 50 feet, but it appears that this Edmond Dantès, this dangerous man's name was—" "Edmond Dantès. It appears, sir, that this Edmond Dantès had procured tools, or had made them, for they found a tunnel through which the prisoners held communication with one another." "This tunnel was dug, no doubt, with an intention of escape?" "No doubt. But unfortunately for the prisoners, the Abbé Faria had an attack of catalepsy and died." "That must have cut short the projects of escape." "Well, for the dead man, yes," replied Monsieur de Beauville, "but not for the survivor. On the contrary, this Dantès saw a means of accelerating his escape. He no doubt thought that prisoners who died in the Château d'If were interred in an ordinary burial ground, and he conveyed the dead man into his own cell, took his place in the sack in which they sewed up the corpse, and awaited the moment of interment." "It was a bold step, one that showed some courage," remarked the Englishman. "As I have already told you, sir, he was a very dangerous man, and fortunately, by his own act, disembarrassed the government of the fears it had on his account." "How was that?" "How? Do you not comprehend?" "No." "The Château d'If has no cemetery. They simply throw the dead into the sea after fastening a 36-pound cannonball to their feet." "Well," observed the Englishman, as if he were slow of comprehension. "Well, they fastened a 36-pound ball to his feet and threw him into the sea." "Really?" exclaimed the Englishman. "Yes, sir," continued the inspector of prisons. "You may imagine the amazement of the fugitive when he found himself flung headlong over the rocks. I should like to have seen his face at that moment." "That would have been difficult." "No matter," replied de Beauvais, in supreme good humor at the certainty of recovering his 200,000 francs. "No matter, I can fancy it." And he shouted with laughter. "So can I," said the Englishman. And he laughed too, but he laughed as the English do, at the end of his teeth. "And so," continued the Englishman, who first gained his composure, "he has drowned?" "Unquestionably." "So that the governor got rid of the dangerous and the crazy prisoner at the same time?" "Precisely." "But some official document was drawn up as to this affair, I suppose?" inquired the Englishman. Yes. The Mortuary Deposition. You understand, Dante's relations, if he had any, might have some interest in knowing if he were dead or alive. So that now, if there were anything to inherit from him, they might do it with easy conscience. He is dead, and no mistake about it." "Oh, yes, and they may have the fact attested whenever they please." "So be it," said the Englishman. "But to return to these registers. True, the story has diverted our attention from them. Excuse me." "Excuse you for what? For the story? By no means. It really seems to me very curious." "Yes, indeed. So, sir, you wish to see all relating to the poor abbé, who really was gentleness itself?" "Yes. You will much oblige me." "Go into the study there, and I will show it to you." And they both entered Monsieur de Beauvais' study. Everything there arranged in perfect order. Each register had its number, each file of papers its place. The inspector begged the Englishman to seat himself in an armchair, and placed before him the register and documents relative to the Château d'If, giving him all the time he desired for the examination, while de Beauvais seated himself in a corner and began to read his newspaper. The Englishman easily found the entries relative to the Abbé Faria, but it seemed that the history which the inspector had related interested him greatly, for, after having perused the first documents, he turned over the leaves until he reached the deposition regarding Edmond Dantès. There he found everything arranged in due order: the accusation, examination, Morel's petition, Monsieur de Villefort's marginal notes. He folded up the accusation quietly, and put it as quietly in his pocket, read the examination, and saw that the name of Noirtier was not mentioned in it, perused, too, the application dated 10th April, 1815, in which Morel, by the deputy procuror's advice, exaggerated with the best of intentions, for Napoleon was then on the throne, the services Dantès had rendered to the imperial cause, services which Villefort's certificates rendered indispensable. Then he saw through the whole thing. This petition to Napoleon, kept back by Villefort, to become, under the Second Restoration, a terrible weapon against him in the hands of the king's attorney. He was no longer astonished when he searched on to find in the register this note, placed in a bracket against his name: Edmond Dantès, an inveterate Bonapartist, took an active part in the return from the island of Elba, to be kept in strict solitary confinement, and to be closely watched and guarded. Beneath these lines was written in another hand: "See note above. Nothing can be done." He compared the writing in the bracket with the writing of the certificate placed beneath Morel's petition, and discovered that the note in the bracket was in the same writing as the certificate. That is to say, it was Villefort's handwriting. As to the note which accompanied this, the Englishman understood that it might have been added by some inspector who had taken a momentary interest in Dante's situation, but who had, from the remarks we have quoted, found it impossible to give any effect to the interest he had felt. As we have said, the inspector, from discretion, and that he might not disturb the Abbé Faria's pupil in his researches, had seated himself in a corner, and was reading Le Drapeau Blanc. He did not see the Englishman fold up and place in his pocket the accusation written by Danglars under the arbor of La Réserve, and which had the postmark Marseille, 27th February, delivery 6:00 p.m. But it must be said that, if he had seen it, he attached so little importance to this scrap of paper, and so much importance to his 200,000 francs, that he would not have opposed whatever the Englishman might do, however irregular it might be. "Thanks," said the latter, closing the register with a slam. "I have all I want. Now it is for me to perform my promise. Give me a simple assignment of your debt, acknowledge therein the receipt of the cash, and I will hand over to you the money." He rose and gave his seat to Monsieur Bovy, who took it without ceremony and quickly drew up the required assignment, while the Englishman counted out the banknotes on the other side of the desk. So ends Chapter 28, The Prison Register.